range of impacts into the South African landscape and memory. It is 200 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is 200 years since they arrived as paupers on ships. So tomorrow, so please contact Kenrad in terms of that issue of unpacking the 1820 settler legacy. And because this is a...
Can't hear you. Sound is gone.
Okay, because this is a kind of a... Because this is the kind of archiving situation, at some point we're going to just press record and get going. All right.
Sure.
Just give it one more minute. Okay, I think we can get going. I'm going to ask that we start recording the session. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This is the 4th out of 5 in our Living History seminar series in which we are hosting Professor Raymond Satna. And I think we've had many, so the other engagements we've had have been really rigorous and strong and very, we've grappled with some issues. So I think our intent, if I can remind everyone, is to try to really do history and building a university ethos where we really believe in intergenerational conversation. So with that, welcome to today's discussion on popular struggles and contemporary politics. The discussant for today is our big brother and dissident, ever a dissident, but the kindest person I know, Mazibuko Jaha, one of the most upright and principled, but hilariously funny people, humble activists who really have made their mark in the South African political landscape, both at the level of big ideas and big politics, but also very much rooted in what is happening in the rural areas in our communities, and also in a range of struggles from LGBTQI struggles, excuse me, socio-economic rights, just name it. Budmazibuko is one of those pillars of ours in the Eastern Cape that keeps the politics of people's agency alive in all of our lives, and also a very good mentor, very generous person to those of us. So to have both of you ex-Communist Party members here today is very, very wonderful for us. So Mazibuko, I will call on you once Professor Satna has made his presentation. Yeah, let's go. Thank you, Raymond.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? I'm unmuted now. The title of the talk is not as wide as the poster said, Popular Democracy Today. It really is about the lessons of the UDF for today, and those lessons relate to the prospects for popular democracy because I believe, and I'm pretty sure Mazibuko also believes, that democracy should not be restricted to periodically voting every 5 years and being spectators for the rest of the time. And one of the lessons of the UDF is that there is a different type of politics that is possible, whatever the problems with the UDF, because the UDF period was not unproblematic. I should say that when some people speak about the UDF, they have a mischievous intent. As I mentioned in my paper, John Daniel, for example, the late John Daniel called an article Lusaka Wins, because the way the UDF period is depicted in much of the literature is as a contrast between the good of the UDF and the evil of exile. And my reason for engaging with the UDF is not with that in mind, although I think that we can have legitimate criticisms of both the UDF experience and the exile experience, but I'm not wanting to demonize one and romanticize the other. The UDF period, in my view, is the primary example of popular democracy in South African history, although it's not the only one. And before the UDF period, there was in the Ponderland uprising, there were mountain courts, for example. And in the period since the UDF, there have been some examples of popular struggle and popular democracy in organizations like Abakhali Basimjondrolo and Equal Education, and a number of other smaller organizations. There may be bigger ones of which I'm not aware, that are not getting adequate coverage. But it is important, I think, to talk about this period and also not treat it as one entirely of contrast between the ANC of the time and the UDF of the time. Because I think while the UDF was different, there were also large areas of convergence between them. And it's important also that we try to understand exactly what its significance was. When Jeremy Seekings, in his book on the UDF, says that what the UDF did was that it put the question of power on the agenda. What does that mean? How did it put the question of power on the agenda? For me, the significance of the UDF, if I can give a generalized statement at the beginning, is that it put the question of power in a different way from that which had preceded its appearance on the scene of history. Until the period of the UDF, power used to be regarded as something in an instrumentalist way, something that you seized, something that you transferred, a thing at some future moment. And with this high respect for that great future moment, after which all else would follow, there was a downplaying of the significance of what was done prior to that. Although the trade union experience already before the UDF was focusing on building tomorrow today. In the literature of struggle, there is a tendency, especially from Leninism, to stress insurrectionism, which depends on a particular moment, but also even at the time of the negotiations. I remember Joe Slovo referring to an agreement which gave us elements of power. In other words, power was a set of things. We didn't have the whole thing yet. And that, to me, is one of the paradigms that got questioned during the UDF period. It was a period of democracy from below, although the extent to which it worked, the extent to which it realized that notion of self-empowerment and democracy from below varied, because at some moments there was a high level of coercion within the UDF structures. There was a high level of intolerance at some points of other tendencies, like the Black consciousness tendencies at certain moments. And I think what we need to do when we consider the popular power period is try to have a scheme whereby we can assess under what conditions can popular power work and under what conditions does it degenerate into coercion, excessive violence, and other excesses. What I found very interesting in this period as a person who had been working on the Freedom Charter is that the period of the UDF led to a rereading of the Freedom Charter, and that didn't come from academics. It came from the grounds. I quote Weza Made from Uitenhage, I believe he's still around, as saying that what we are doing here in the street committees and area committees is we are implementing the first clause of the Freedom Charter, the people shall govern. Until the period of the 1980s, the way the first clause of the Freedom Charter was understood was to mean universal suffrage, that at a certain moment everyone would have the vote. Now, we must not underestimate the significance of that, because in a country where Africans, in particular Black people more generally, were regarded as boys and girls, to have universal adult suffrage was a massive gain. But the UDF period introduced a modification whereby it was no longer the way in which the people shall govern was understood, was no longer purely on a focus on having the vote one day. It was what you could do right now, wherever you were living. It is what some people have called prefigurative democracy, building the new South Africa now. And people like Matthew Skoniwe argue very much that the way you acted at that time prefigured the type of society that you wanted to build. And if you acted in an undemocratic or violent or in other way abusive way in that period, in a sense, you were building the type of South Africa that you would see in the future. And I think it is true to say that some of the problems that we do have today relate to that past, some of that past being romanticized by us, some of that past not being adequately understood by us. Now, I quote Matthew Skoniwe, Terra Lakota, and Murphy Morobe on this question of the relationship between means and ends, not being things that are completely separated, not having this idea that we may do some things now, but the main thing is what happens in that moment of transfer of power. The problem with the notion of transfer of power is that it is instrumentalist. It views power as a thing, and it's passed from one set of rulers to another. And even though there was attainment of political power in the sense of majority rule in 1994, there are a whole lot of things that did not happen at that moment. And Poulantzas captures this very well. I quote him on page 6. To take or capture state power is not simply to lay hands on part of the state machinery in order to replace it with a second power. Power is not a quantifiable substance held by the state that must be taken out of its hands, but rather a series of relations amongst the various classes. The state is neither a thing instrument that may be taken away, nor a fortress that may be penetrated by means of a wooden horse, nor yet a safe that may be cracked by burglary. It is the heart of the exercise of political power as a series of relationships that have to be negotiated or struggled over in the state, outside the state, after the so-called attainment of power and before. The instrumental conception of power tends to devalue immediate activity of trade unions, civics, educational organizations, and a range of others. And that notion of democracy of the UDF period then was not one where they denied the transfer of power, because it was not fully theorized, but there was a coexistence between insurrectionary practices in which many people engaged, and also the notion that what people did then and there was very important. That they understood it as a moment of self-empowerment where they did not have to wait for leaders to tell them what to do. It is true that the ANC had called for the establishment of popular organizations, and people did listen to Radio Freedom. Not everyone, but very many people in the UDF did regard themselves as falling under the discipline of the ANC. But when the ANC called for ungovernability and then later for the establishment of elementary organs of popular power, people in Lusaka and even the UDF leaders national leaders in Johannesburg were not able to determine how it would be implemented on the ground, because that depended on conditions that varied in a number of different parts of South Africa, townships, rural areas, and other places. And the UDF appropriated many of the traditions of the past, but sometimes these did not work so well. For example, the notion of the M plan was claimed to be appropriated, especially, I think, in Port Elizabeth. But if you look at the M plan is a top-down plan. It's where instructions are communicated downwards. Now, the UDF idea didn't always happen in practice, was that people at various locations would be consulted over the way of doing things. Now, people's power was not always successful. It was most successful, from the evidence that I have encountered, people like Janet Cherry and Michael Neocosmos and others have researched, it's been most successful when it involved broad elements of the community. When there was not this broad involvement, coercion often resulted, kangaroo courts and things like that. And that happened especially in the period of the states of emergency, when most of the leadership, the older people, were arrested and the youth took control, or in some cases gangsters were able to infiltrate. So the level of violence was not, let me say, it was there without the state of emergency. There was a fairly high intolerance of some trends other than that of the Congress movement, of which the UDF saw itself as a part. But when the state locked up the older, more experienced people, there was a greater tendency towards violence. But there were some notable examples of successful implementation of activities that sometimes involve violence, like consumer boycotts were often enforced with violence. But in Port Alfred, they had what they called a central committee. The women, the youth, the unions, the civics, all came together. We used to listen to Radio Freedom, get guidelines, read the January 8th statement, try to implement those things. When ANC statements were made, they usually said to the youth, we say, to the students, we say. In one year, they called the Year of the Youth. The UDF structures initiate the establishment of large numbers of youth organizations. So there was a direct relationship between the hegemony of the ANC and the UDF. But as Oliver Tambo says in the interview that I quote, ANC didn't set up the UDF, despite what Govan Mbeki says in another quotation I have there. The ANC always wanted popular struggle to be established, but the type of organizations that were part of the UDF, some of them were not political at all. Some of them were just, they were political in the sense that they accepted the declaration of the UDF, but they were primarily traders or sports organizations or things like that. Now, the ANC did not run the UDF, as I say, because the UDF had to implement things in very specific conditions. But the ANC often knew the language, even better than the UDF, the language that would persuade people. Often this was militaristic language. Like in the UDF, the leadership was trying its best to get students to go back to school. They wouldn't go back to school. When the ANC saw them and said to them, the classrooms are your trenches, they went back, albeit not permanently. So the ANC had a better idea in some ways, but there was this general loyalty towards the ANC, mediated by the fact that whatever the ANC may have wanted to achieve had to be done in very concrete conditions, which people on the ground knew better. Now, Govan Mbeki talks about the underground running the UDF. Now, there were a lot of people in the underground who were also part of UDF, and there was some attempt to connect the underground and MK to what UDF was doing. For example, one of the first attacks on police stations was an attack on the Soekmekaar police station, which had been involved in forced removals. Sometimes MK would destroy a railway line when a strike had been called to make it impossible for people to get to work. So it's wrong for some people to contrast MK to the UDF, MK as being military and UDF being political, because the political activities of MK, insofar as they were successful, were mainly as armed propaganda. The UDF had unique things that it brought into the struggle. But as Marx says in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Very often, when people are doing something completely new, they like to paint it in the colors of bygone ages. And the UDF drew its legitimacy from the 1950s, as depicting itself as a version of the 1950s. Now, it's true that the UDF did follow these large traditions, but it's very important for us to recognize that it was, and those who were in the UDF to recognize that they were also doing something completely new. But there remained this B team type mentality. And that is why when the ANC was unbanned, the UDF saw itself as a curtain raiser. And the ANC didn't force the UDF to dissolve, it dissolved itself. In my view, there were a number of other alternatives. It was possible for the UDF to continue as a coordinating body of a number of different organizations parallel to the ANC. But I think a lot of the people in the UDF, like I quote Frank Chikane saying that what we did in the UDF was a sort of holding action. In other words, we held the fort till the main team came on the field of history, then we returned to the changing rooms. Now, when people contrast the ANC to the UDF, I think they fail to see the continuities and the differences. At the level of debate, it's said the UDF had all this debate and there was no debate in exile, but this is not true. Sometimes the debate would start in Lusaka, it would go to Angola, it would then go to some other part of the world, and lots of debate was happening in exile. That's not to suggest that debate of ordinary soldiers necessarily became part of the decision-making process, but the contrasts are not as big as people suggest. There was also widespread adoption of doctrine, which was similar to that of the ANC in Lusaka and other places. For example, Progress publishers from Moscow, books were being read here just as they were being read in the camps, and they're still being read today, by the way, by a lot of people. It must be the only part of the world where they are still very much in good standing. But what I think was important is that some of the ideas of insurrectionary approach, this fixation of power in an instrumental way, was completely common to both, even though the practice of the UDF broadened that notion beyond that of that which they inherited. I mentioned the fact that intolerance, in an earlier contribution, I said that pluralism was not part of the tradition that was adopted by the ANC. It was this notion of we are one. And I think in the period of the UDF, there was a lot of conflict between the UDF and Azasim, the so-called Zimzims. I was once asked to go out to the Soweto Youth Congress, and what was interesting, apart from the not being convinced that they shouldn't beat up the Black consciousness people, was that they used democratic centralism as their mode of organization. So that was another continuity between exile, particularly the Communist Party, and the UDF. What I think we have to ask ourselves in my last 5 minutes is, what is the relevance of this for us today? What is the future of popular democracy? We are living through a period where representative democracy or liberal democracy is in crisis. All over the world, there's a crisis. People are cynical about elections. They're cynical about democracy. And what we've got to understand, and that was true of the 80s as well, is that when there is a cynicism about democratic possibilities, it opens the way not just for the popular, but also for populism. By the popular, I understand having a program which is meant to benefit the poor and the marginalized, and that is done through organization. Populism is through the advancement of slogans, and it can, because it's not based on concrete programs and organizations, it can easily become right-wing or left-wing populism. And I think we've seen that this cynicism towards elections and representative democracy has led to the fall of formerly left-wing governments like the Party of Workers in Brazil, but also in the United States, the rise of Trump, and fascist developments in a number of other parts of the world like Poland, Hungary, Philippines, India, and others. So we've got to ask ourselves, how do we use this period to redevelop the popular? And we've got very few popular organizations. My belief is that we've got to take the resources that we see around us, resources that are not always directly political, acts of kindness between human beings, which manifest a collectivity. At the beginning of the lockdown, there was a sense of caring because we all stood together in the face of COVID-19. We all had to try and find a way of wearing masks and protecting one another. Now, those are very small, that's a very small example. I've got other very small examples, like when old ladies trip and you help them up, things like that. These are examples of kindness and caring, which can be the core of something bigger. And I think we've got to look around us and ask ourselves, what is there in our society that can be the basis for a popular organization, and find ways of joining together. Organization is different from rhetoric, which is populism. Organization requires patient, careful listening to people over a long time, and only after that can you expect to see results. But I believe that it is important that we do not resign ourselves to our politics being purely voting every 5 years, that we find ways of coexisting of representative democracy. I don't think we should be abolishing the vote, coexisting of representative democracy with popular democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. As Budmazibuko comes on to the platform, if you can switch on his video and his mic, I just think there are three, or maybe two or three things that we will think about as Budmazibuko responds. The first is that, I've often felt that this distinction between exile and internal was almost a manufactured story, largely by academics who have simple narratives. Of course, those things exist, but I think your position on those distinctions is something to think about. Secondly, the issue of what happens when what is popular becomes what is authoritarian. The role of young people in our struggle, both in building up popular movements that were important, but at the same time, young people who brought about huge amounts of violence and vigilante punitive practices in their own communities, which I think many of us will remember, that you were terrified of young men under the ban of our comrades gathering to decide a justice issue in the community, including punishing their own girlfriends and punishing people for any kind of behavior. That popular space is what created the possibility for that. And then, of course, this broader issue around what is populist versus what is popular. And I have a question that I think Mazibuko just noted as well, around whether or not we are romanticizing and transmitting a romantic concept of the popular in our political culture, thus leading to a lot of things that you see where young people think that any collective action is just, even when it has got problems in itself. So over to you, brother.
Thanks, Nomalanga. How much time do I have?
10 to 15 minutes.
Yes, okay. No, thank you. That will be enough. Thanks to Comrade Raymond for the thoughtful presentation and paper. I will not go to the debate about the relationship of understanding how the UDF related to the ANC or constructed itself in terms of an ANC mandate and so on. I'll focus my comments and response on democracy and to take it back to the theme of the day, popular democracy today, which then connects with the question Nomalanga has just asked. Several points which I think are useful from Comrade Raymond's presentation. Indeed, there is a frustration on a mass level with the limited form of democracy we have today. So those who still have the historical memory of the UDF period tend to refer back to it for reasons of this frustration. Secondly, I think what Comrade Raymond has put forward, which is very important, is the messiness of building power, power from below in particular. It's not easy, it's not straightforward, it's not linear, which is where then the question Nomalanga is bringing up is important. Because the people, as they are often claimed, our people and so on, they are often seen in romantic terms, even those who seek to get the people to be active agents or seek to advance the interests of the people, represent the people in those romantic terms. The same applies to those who seek to speak on behalf of the working class or mobilize the working class. What those formulations and representations ignore is the diversity of interests within the people, within this so-called popular forces. That diversity of experiences at times can even mean competition over limited resources, which then leads to all sorts of intensity, all sorts of problematic conduct, which ultimately does not advance democracy itself, does not advance the interests of the people, or does not, as Raymond has said elsewhere, expand the realms of freedom in any meaningful transformative way. So the building of power, particularly in a context when there's been a long history of undemocratic rule, it becomes very tricky, becomes very complex. Of course, the UDF period did throw up very creative responses from below, where people went beyond the limits of the undemocratic rule they faced. But even as they did that, the example of kangaroo courts, the example of comrade Tsotsis or male comrades, as Nomalanga was saying, using the power they were beginning to build in messy ways, in problematic ways that undermine the very goal. It's also a very, very important reality of that UDF experience. So this takes me then to another point. It's not just messiness, it's also unevenness. Raymond referred to moments of coercion, moments of intolerance, but also at the same time, there were moments of autonomous power from below in ways that really made a difference. There is the famous story of when the very massive Alexandra Civic Organization led by Moses Maegiso and others had done thorough work in Alexandra to manage the situation of crime through street level committees that would build up to the level of a block committees connecting and with other block committees to the level of a section of the township until that structure from below reached as far as possible to cover most of Alex, such that for a period of about 2 to 3 months, according to the historical record, there was a period of no crime in Alex, even though the police were actually quite minimized in their presence because of that extent of mobilization by the community. So that presents quite an interesting example of autonomous power from below, but that could not be sustained, which takes us back to the question Raymond is asking. What are the critical conditions that would shape the life, the evolution, the trajectory, the depth, the substantive meaning, the quality, the texture, the richness and impact of democracy? I think today, with our limited form of democracy, we've tended to lose the historical experience of enriching those conditions, of grappling with how to nurture those conditions that really take democracy forward in a meaningful way. Which then means that our prefigurative experiment of building a democracy that of the kind that would really transform South African society has been limited. What was prefigured in the UDF period, in my view, got trumped by the transition to a post-apartheid dispensation for a number of reasons, which I hope to have time to come to. Nomalanga, I want to conclude then this part with reference to your question. When you are being critical of popular forces, and also those who tend to support popular forces, myself and others, are we romanticizing the popular without being critical, without actually working through the mess of popular democracy? Today in South Africa, the material conditions that we have, socially, economically, and otherwise, all of us know that it will take one matchstick at some point to lead to a massive social upheaval. Now, my fear about that, which connects with the critique you are making, is that because of the weakening of progressive popular democracy, such a social upheaval can actually be harnessed, be captured by what Raymond refers to as populist forces, which oftentimes have a reactionary agenda, which is not about deepening the very democracy or elements of direct democracy or elements of participatory democracy that are required. So this question is real, Nomalanga, for me. Of course, we've seen instances of it at various moments of struggle throughout the post-1994 period. How, for example, the conduct in relation to public property when there are strikes, or even notions about understanding. I remember a very telling example in this regard. I had come from Kaiskamahoek to Echini, Makanda, as part of the Solidarity with Fears Must Fall. We had a meeting with several student leaders and activists at the UPM. And those of us who were from the non-student component of the meeting were arguing some 2 weeks of trying to deal with
Mazibuko, sorry. I think your mic has just done something. Can you just shift it a bit?
Okay, is it better?
Yes, Nazogo. So just start that again. You were saying something about, solidarity.
Okay. Now, we're a number of movements who were invited by the UPM, Unemployed People's Movement, in Echini to a solidarity meeting with students. So the idea of the meeting was to see what action we could build in support of the students. And largely those who were non-student components in that meeting were arguing for some 2 weeks in order to undertake some mobilization, reaching out to churches, to other groups in the townships in Grahamstown, so that we could really build for some big action which would support the students. The students felt that they were the most directly affected and that they could decide what should happen. And if we didn't join the march tomorrow, then we're sellouts. I'm bringing that example not to be unfair to the students, but it's an interesting example, because what do you do to sellouts then when there's a legitimate struggle? Do you burn them at the altar? Do you necklace them? Do you condemn them? Or do you take time for the debate to actually exhaust itself and see through practice how to win broader support for a legitimate struggle? It's a small example of how then we should regard the popular, particularly when it comes to ultimately the trajectory of that kind of struggle, which way it could have gone. I want to move further then from that engagement about this question Nomalanga was asking. There's another element which we have to think about in response to what Raymond is saying. So the UDF period did bring the question of power in a real way, and as such, what we have is representative democracy, which gives us a democratic state, which also has put very firmly on the agenda of the nation the enjoyment of rights within a constitutional rights-based dispensation. That was quite present in the UDF struggles. For example, the struggles of civics under the UDF, no taxation as having a power in the municipal affairs at the time. So those things have come forward in a big way and continue to live in post-apartheid South Africa. However, there are limits, which I'll come back to just now. The one element of democracy, I think Raymond is leading us in that direction as well, that is substantively weakened in our post-apartheid dispensation, is popular collective self-empowerment. In the EDF period, there was a stronger element of that than there is today. And the contrast for me is that in the EDF period, that popular collective self-empowerment experiments that took place when we had no power, when we had no rights. And when we have reached a period in history when we have power and rights, then the popular collective self-empowerment elements are much more diminished. We had more voice as popular forces back in the UDF period than we have today when we're supposed to have rights. We have rights, but we have no voice of the kind that can take forward democracy. And I think, in my view, there are several elements that were not so apparent, were not so present in a visible way during the UDF period. And the impact of globalization, of what others have referred to as neoliberal policies, whether it's economic or even the functioning of the state, where basically the concern is about how security. Do you protect the production conditions of a small group of commercial farmers? Or do you opt for a more democratic system of land ownership and production, which would then disrupt the production system of farmers? What does that do to democracy? What does that do to levels of popular participation? So I'm pulling out those examples to say today, one of the major limitations on democracy is the preponderance, the overbearing dominance of the neoliberal script, whether it's in the economy, whether it's in how government understands how it should relate to ordinary people. Having said that, there are very interesting experiments, though, that are beginning to emerge, challenging these limits to democracy. Even if they do not draw back to the UDF in terms of historical memory, but in terms of practice, they are very interesting. The one is the Unemployed People's Movement there in Makanda. They have struggled for some 11, 12 years, challenging a dysfunctional, undemocratic municipality. Several times, they were to approach the provincial state, the national state, the courts. An administrator had been brought through at some point. The question which we debated with the UPM at the time was, the term of the administrator will come to an end. What happens to the demands of the UPM? Because ultimately the same lot of ANC councillors will come back. How does the UPM go beyond just a challenge? Does the UPM begin to construct a dual power a popular power outside of the formal constitutional structures that we have from legislation. It's a question that has come back to the UPM today as it responds to COVID-19, as it grapples with the dissolution of the municipality by a court decision. Now I know they are debating what does this mean for the 2021 local government elections. It's not easy, therefore. When I pull out the example of the UPM, it's not easy because the UPM itself has got messy elements in terms of its strength, its capacities, its vision, its practices. But at the same time, through action, they've confronted these questions about the meaning of democracy and how deep they should go. Similarly, another organization to bring to bear here is the Amadiba Crisis Committee in the north of the Eastern Cape, just before the KwaZulu-Natal border, which has fought an Australian a combination of powerful forces, the Australian Mining Company, the state, as well as traditional leaders, to assert from a democratic customary perspective. We've got traditions, we've got practices about land, about natural resources. This will be undermined in particular ways. And we will use our voice and power to challenge those. It's been very interesting. But in this instance, their democratic practices, their assertion of democratic power has been in response, has been in critique. And also now, because of that experience of some 15 years, they have begun to ask themselves questions. If we are opposed to mining in the way proposed, what actually is our alternative? And how do we construct that alternative? Do we construct it from above, or do we engage? The community is somewhat divided, as you can imagine, because of the dire economic circumstances. So again, as they face that division in the community, they have to grapple with some questions. How do they ensure that they win other components in the community in ways that advance the collective interest ultimately? So my concluding point is that, Comrade Raymond, I think your reflection is very useful, and that reflection, in my view, has to grapple with the challenges of democracy today, particularly then the impact of neoliberalism and the very nascent experiences of the kind that we see in the UPM, in Amadiba, and beyond. But also, let's do that, let's grapple with that in ways that take us to Nomalanga's question. What do we do when the masses are wrong? When I say the masses are wrong, I'm not saying that from some holy scripture from above, but from the perspective of, or even the vision of emancipation that we have. Are we going to allow radical postures that are populist? How do we democratically grapple with those without being authoritarian? And we cannot go back, in my view, to notions of democratic
commerce to be a way in which to allocate either patronage or political positions within the party or in the state, to the extent that whether one knows the party, whether that is assumed to be some fixed identity in its history or in the memory of those that know it or not, has been a function of questions about their suitability for leadership of the party. So it may not have been real as far as conceptually within the Congress movement, but it has had practical implications in terms of allocations of roles and power in the Congress. I mean, the current debate, for example, is the extent to which the president knows the ANC and whether he should be supported or not, or is the rightful leader, you know? So I wanted to find out what he makes of that practical, how in practice, whatever the wrong separation he problematizes, you know, how does it relate with what's happened in practice?
Okay, can I just invite Alan Zinn to pose a question?
Thank you to the speakers today. I've just been wondering, after reading the paper and the input today, what your comment is around the 1980s sort of your transition in the labor movement, with when you had rising what we would call working class power, as we saw in the old, what was called faux SARTU, and then in the mid-80s, the co-SARTU, and the possible class of tensions that arose with the popular power of the UDF, and how has that possibly played out today as we talk about Mazibuko, whether the emphasis on rights but no voice, etc. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Cherry, thanks.
Hi, thanks everybody. Do you want to see me? Let me see how this
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? So thanks, Raymond and Mazibuko. That was really great. This topic is very close to my heart. So the research that I was doing in KwaZulu showed that although there was a strong prefigurative democratic element in terms of neighborhood control, neighborhood street committees, together with quite a lot of intolerance as well, that wasn't manifest in terms of what I could call economic prefiguration. So there were I struggled to find instances where people took economic control through anything like food distribution or controlling water or that kind of thing. And setting up cooperatives which functioned, which were productive, etc. And I think that's where the gap is. I'm just thinking about Mazibuko's comments about unemployed people's movement and a Madiba crisis committee. Those are defensive struggles. They're not prefigurative of a different way of doing things and whether we should do things in a different way. Anyway, thanks. You can comment on that.
I think this should be Mastole Boy.
Thank you very much, Prof. Let me firstly thank Prof and Comrade Mazibuko and you, Professor Mkhize, for this insightful and historical conversation. For me, I have two questions, I think, for both speakers. I think the first one is the instrumentalist view Prof spoke about, and the instrumentalist conception of understanding power or the state. So for me, I want to understand how this instrumentalist view shaped the post-1994 political spectrum and how it shaped the conception of the electorate and the political elites, and how this also create a false dichotomy between the activists and the masses. So I want to understand from both speakers, how does this instrumentalist view shaped the post-1994 political spectrum? So that's the first question. The second question was the military language that Prof spoke about in relation to the ANC, where they projected the classroom as the site of struggle, or the trenches, where they persuaded a student to go back to the classroom. But this military language didn't end in 1994, as we know. It continued, and it became part of the Congress movement, as we know. And people call each other commander-in-chief and guerrillas. And one of the person that writes beautifully about the problematic nature of this military language within the Congress movement is Dr. Spokazi Magadla in her article, EFF and the Return of Warrior Citizen in 2013. And she clearly explained the dangers of this military language of the Congress movement, which was also adopted by EFF, which can be categorized as part of the Congress movement, and how EFF appropriated this language to create a very militaristic element. And as people who grew up in the Congress movement, this military language is very exciting, even though it's a populist political rhetoric language, but it has its own problematic natures and creating a very much masculinist, violent political socialization. So I want to see also from Comrade Jaha, how does this military language affect populist movement? Or how can we reimagine a different popular language in our political structures in organizing, not necessarily relying on the military language, which has its own problematic natures? Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, just to say that what we'll do is we'll take this round of responses, then I'm going to invite any students or younger people to actually engage, if they are willing to, on these questions that Mazibuko raised around dealing with, this intergenerational gap between younger students who say, well, if you don't support us, you're a sellout. I'm interested in how students resolve those things, and then we'll move towards the end. Raymond? On mute, just unmute, please.
On the points that you, Nomalanga, made, I think it's very important that what I've tried to do is must not be interpreted as trying to give a final summation of what UDF achieved, because there were lots of warts as well as lots of good things. What I tried to do is to say that we need to, when we try to establish any popular organization, we have to identify what are the qualities that can make it work. Now, when one speaks of the violence and abuses that occurred during the 1980s, it generally happened when there was very limited organization, or when there was not an adequate intergenerational spread. And what we don't have today, I think, is a lot of intergenerational organizations. No one has, or very few people have respect for the Youth League, and there's a complete dominance of the elder leadership, say, in the ANC. But I think in the UDF, it often happened that you had people from all communities, and then it worked. It generally didn't work in situations where some people claimed in the name of the collective to just do things, in fact, by force of arms. What I find a very important point of Mazibuko's is that there are there's less agency, less self-empowerment in the period of democracy than there was in the 1980s, in a period of opposition, admittedly. But I think what we've got to understand is when the ANC was unbanned, a lot of people, a lot of experts, so-called, advised the ANC to normalize, to modernize, and that really meant shut the masses out. That's how a lot of transition theory worked, that transitions, consolidation of democracy couldn't work if the masses continued to be involved. They should be shut out. Alan's point about the tensions with the unions, I think it's very important that a lot of the first 2 or 3 years of the UDF there was a tension between the so-called workerists who were dominant in Fosatu. But Fosatu was not homogeneous. There were some people who were part of the Congress movement and some who wanted the workers to go it alone. And I think that what happened after 1990 is that it was quite surprising to see who emerged as part of the interim leadership of the Communist Party in different regions, because very many of those people had been so-called workerists before. So I think that we've got to work, even if there is amity at the moment, we've got to understand that there are unresolved questions about the relationship between working class struggles and generalized so-called community struggles covering everyone. There are distinct interests within unified interests that have not necessarily been adequately resolved. On Janet's point, I've got very bad handwriting, so I can't read everything clearly here. But I think that I'm in agreement that the whole UDF experience is not a very neat experience. There's a lot of things that were erased in these conditions. Now, what I think is important is that she refers to the lack of economic empowerment. Now, if you include the unions as organs of people's power, that was an example which was not adequately voiced of self-empowerment at the level of the working class. So that even before the UDF was formed, unions were using phrases like building tomorrow today. And I think it's the way in which we conceived some of these things that was problematic. Now, with regard to Masikole, is that Mr. Comrade Boy's first name?
Yeah, we must call.
Masikole. Sorry,
do you want him to repeat it in brief?
I found it here. Okay, can you, now the military language is the second point, but it's very important because the military language doesn't only live on in the EFF, it's part of the celebration of violence. Last week, I spoke about Chief Luthuli. Chief Luthuli, when it was the 50th anniversary of the Nobel Prize, it was also the 50th anniversary of NK. ANC, 99% of the time referred to MK, hardly made reference to Luthuli. So that's what I think one of the residues of this militarism is we have never celebrated peace and non-violence. And that, I think, is one of the unfortunate problems of today. On the instrumentalism, what exactly was the remark again? Because I've got here a number of NBs, but I can't read what the point was. Can you repeat it, Nomalanga? On instrumentalism, please.
Mascole, if I can ask you to just very briefly repeat your question, maybe just to refresh.
Yeah, briefly, Prof. I wanted to understand how the instrumentalist view shaped the political spectrum post-1994. For instance, the issue of categorization of leadership and the masses, the activists and the masses, the political elites. How did it impact on the force dichotomy between the separation of these things?
Well, I think...
okay.
Sorry.
Are you good, Raymond?
I've got it, yeah. I think that the instrumentalist conception led to a top-down politics, whereby the notion of service delivery is a very good example. You are not yourself involved in that. You wait for the state to deliver. If they don't deliver, you protest. You're not involved in it. So instrumentalism was a notion of getting power, but by implication, it's been interpreted is once the ANC got power, they would deliver to the people who would be passive recipients. And I think that is one of how I read the ongoing effect of that instrumentalism today, that there's not a relationship. The people who are recipients of these benefits or these rights are not themselves involved in the process of acquiring it. Thank you. That's, I think,
Mazibuko, thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick it up from there. So I think Comrade Raymond has dealt with how instrumentalism has been constructed from above. So to an extent, I don't think it can really be avoided, because ultimately it is ordinary people whose power must bear in the sphere of politics, economics, culture, and so on. So those who want to change those spheres have to rely on building ordinary people as the instrument. For me, the key to address the problem Ascole is raising is, can we take consciousness building, mobilization, and action to the point where there's a sufficient momentum in society of conscious, critical, committed, and capable self-protagonists on a mass scale? Those self-protagonists with agency and ability to reflect. If we can do that, I think then we are creating a condition where it will be possible to overcome instrumentalism from above. What that implies is some sustained work over a long period of time to build those kind of attributes and elements in society, particularly right where people are. The second question then, Mascole, is about your use of military language. Again, I'm not going to its impact and so on, but to say what is missing in, hold on for a minute. Sorry about that. What is missing in our society is a reference to actual cultures of people as they live them. So even in Madaisini, when the young men play the dice game in the corner in the township, there are ways to think through conviviality, common approaches to problems. Even at church, of course, in the colonial period, there was a period of Inkolazwe or Istwalandwe after war. So not everything was necessarily resolved militarily. So there are these cultural attributes which I don't think we're drawing enough of in our political constructions that I think are crucial to go forward. An interesting organization in this regard is a group in Khayelitsha called the Khayelitsha Peace Builders. Their focus is to try and facilitate conviviality, conversation to resolve complex problems in the township of Khayelitsha and Cape Town. The last question is the one Janet raised, which Janet, I rephrase in my own thinking as that unfinished task of reconstruction and development. Indeed, I agree with you. We do need to focus more attention on those elements that are prefigurative, particularly to meet people's needs. And the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown has thrown up tens of examples, if not hundreds, in all sorts of communities where people are putting together kitchen assemblies as a political space, but also as a space to meet immediate needs. And people have begun to reimagine what can be done. So the challenge with even that, though, is that we've not yet reached a critical mass in society such that this is becoming a preponderant logic across many communities. It's still subject to all sorts of strains, including reliance on the state, which, as we know, has tended to instrumentalize, has tended to undermine initiative from below. But like Christians, as a communist, I'm hopelessly hopeful in this regard that actually we can ultimately get there if we continue with sustaining mobilization, learning lessons, and then hopefully things over time can reach that critical mass.
As I had said, I would invite any students or former students who were active in the 2016 period, if they want to reflect on some of how these questions affect the way they understood their mobilizing. Some of them are no longer students, so they're keeping quiet. No? Okay. Of course, I mean, this also just reflects, I think, maybe some of the difficulties of dealing with one's struggle in retrospect and having to analyze oneself, which it's easy when you're doing it to somebody else's struggle. It's easy when we are looking back at Raymond's generation or Mazibuko's generation, and we can give you a textbook analysis of the problem. But when it's still fresh and people are trying to make sense of their own struggles, it takes a while, especially when it's now subject to public judgment. Okay, so I think with that, I'd like to thank everyone. I don't know if there are any burning questions still, but I think we've really, the questions posed here are actually fundamentally important for the fabric of South Africa's future. And the question is, yours was not answered, Mdimka. Your question was basically about inzals and exiles. I don't really want to waste any more time, but I think Raymond, perhaps Ongama wasn't satisfied with how you dealt with the issue, if you did touch on it. He basically asked, now I don't want to summarize it by butchering it. Ongama, just very briefly remind the question again.
It was to ask, what does Prof make of the practical
Seniority.
differentiation in practice between the exiles and the insiles, and how that was used to allocate the distribution of opportunities to lead and to be deployed. And currently, questions about whether Cyril knows the party or anybody else who was in the UDF knows the party better than anybody else who joined the party underground.
Yeah. Okay, so I think if I could just reformulate with my own interpretation, is there a sense in which, and maybe Mazibuko, you can quickly comment on this as well, is there a sense in which that there was in practice a kind of a natural assumption that certain people would be the ones who take certain forms of leadership and also benefit in terms of the kind of assistance and opportunity provided once, people were back in the country?
I think that there is an assumption among some people that you were not really part of the ANC if you were not in Lusaka or the camps. And you had this when Terra Lakota was removed as Premier of the Free State. Tito Mboweni said Terra's been in the ANC for a very short time. Now, Terra was recruited on the island. Now, does that not count? And what he did in the UDF, he was doing as an ANC person. So that I think you find that discourse appearing every now and again. I think one must remember that a lot of internal people went into government and got opportunities, and there's not really, at the level of, if there's an elite, at the level of the elite, there's not a big difference between those who were in exile, those who were inside, except it may be that some people, when they want to help someone, their reference point is those they knew in exile, to a greater extent, perhaps, than people internally. But, I'm not myself, I was involved, but I was not very conscious of a sense of exclusion by virtue of having been inside the country and underground and what have you. I didn't pick it up a lot. I don't think that the fact that I didn't get certain positions is related to being inside. It's related to ideological differences and willingness to do certain things and not do other things that led to some people being fast-tracked, not exile or insile, in my opinion.
But Mazibuko?
Our young days in the young Christian students, we would be so inspired, so impressed when we got an exile to come and give an input. That was then. I think that aura is gone though, particularly if you look at the actual makeup of ANC structures, of government structures. Look at the ANC provincial government in the Eastern Cape. Entirely new set of people, even in post-1994 terms of ANC membership. So I think that's, it may be a factor in some small networks, but really, if you look at the entire polity, I don't think it's a real factor. I think what we should be worried about, as Raymond is pointing out, is ideological differences, which at times actually inspired by accumulation interests. In the Eastern Cape in particular, you've got a huge influx into the ANC of people who were former administrators of the homeland governments or even apartheid structures, and of course newer layers whose path to accumulation is through holding political positions. I think that's a more important dynamic today than the ANC, than the exile division that could have existed in the past.
Thank you again. I take it we probably have no questions. So can I just have the poster for the event tomorrow? Nkosi Oxolo, as the poster goes up, can you switch on your mic, contribute or comment on who is active in student struggles? Yeah, I just want to, if we can just share the poster details for the 1820 conversation for tomorrow whilst the student makes a comment. Thanks.
Good day to everyone.
We can't hear you. Just speak a bit louder. Thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I was a bit hesitant with commenting because I joined the meeting a bit later. But I was captured by some of the views that were shared by the post-speakers, particularly on the issue of militarization of political spaces, or rather organization. People spoke strong that ANC is militant and EFF is militant. Now I want to speak particularly on the issue of students and the student movement in 2016, Fees Must Fall. The idea, or rather our engagement on the phenomenon was on the basis of that poverty in nature is violent. And we could not stand back and withhold, the vicious system that we're being met with when we went to those offices of financial aid and whatnot. Now, if you remember, the forces of UTM, they united to liberate, in my small understanding, to liberate the nation of the vicious system of apartheid. They did not only follow an idea, but they enhanced the idea and conscientized the societies in which they existed in. And that is what we believed also in 2016, that people do not understand that there is depth in us being excluded on basis of not being able to pay for education. There was a historical context that led to us, not being able to afford education. We needed to conscientize then our fellow comrades or students that actually there is a reason why as Black students, when we are done with the lecture in our lecture rooms, we go to shuttle stops, whereas our white counterparts or our white students went to the parking lot to get into their own cars. And we made them understand why is it that I won't be able to, we have people who are not returning to the system the following year on basis that they cannot afford. Now, I'm not sure whether, can you hear me?
No, we can hear you, yeah.
So it was an issue that we needed to conscientize people to understand why is it that we're undergoing through the struggles, because we had people who were questioning our actions. So we had to then militarize campuses in people believing Ubana, for us to liberate ourselves against the vicious system of higher education, we needed to then make a clarion call for free education. That is how, Tina, we went about doing this thing. You'd understand that I don't want to be long, but I wrote some pointers here, and I'm a bit nervous because I see there are a lot of professors here who are listening. So you understand that in 1994,
just try and wrap it up so that we don't go too much past time. Maybe there will be some responses as well to your comment. Yeah.
Yeah. See, as I wrap up my last point, there is a relationship between the worker struggles and the student struggles. That is because the people who are working, for instance, your gardeners at school, your cleaners, people who cook for us, they are the people who are our parents as Black students. And now we felt their struggles also as much as they felt ours. Hence, before this thing of Peace Must Fall even started on the ground base, we were there in solidarity with the cleaners and the workers and all of them, because we understood that their struggles, they affect us directly as the student or rather children of the working class. I don't want to be long. I just joined the discussion at a very late stage, but I just felt the urge, to comment. I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know if either Raymond or Mazibuko would like to say a comment or see now, because I'm not good with Zoom. I've lost the screen. I don't know where I am. Any comments from either Raymond or Mazibuko? Any questions? You're good. Okay. Mazibuko, any comment from your side to engage that contribution?
I think there are lessons to learn from the Peace Must Fall moment, because ultimately the key, how do we build power and how do we use that power to win demands? And so
okay. Yeah, so thank you to everybody. I just want to make the announcement. Perhaps I can ask Butsonwabo to assist. So as you can see, tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we are looking at the 1820 settler question, probably the largest mass migration of poverty-stricken refugees from Europe at that time into Africa. The 1820 settlers were that. So there's a lot of interest for me in this topic. And you can email Kenred, email Butsonwabo for the link and the rest of it, or you can find it on Memo. I don't know if there are any more comments and goodbyes, but otherwise, I don't see anything in the chat box. I think this is a conversation that I think is raising some quite difficult questions. I have questions myself from Nkosi Oxolo around how do you discipline each other in your own movement if you're willing to encourage each other to adopt militant stances. These are questions that the ANC had to deal with. And this morning we had a lecture from Judge Albie Sachs, who said the ANC had to deal with the problem of violence within itself, never mind the struggle it was fighting. And I'm curious with today's youth movements, when you take up the language of militarism, what is the ethics that guides that, and who takes responsibility for putting the lives of your peers or their whatever it is on the line? Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Our last session will be in November, I believe. Asemahle will be engaging Satna on the final leg of this. Thank you so much. And see you tomorrow at Kenred 1820 seminar.